A laid-off factory worker in Chicago dragged 3 discarded tires and a piece of tin roofing into an empty dirt lot, handed out a few putters, and charged his neighbors a nickel a round. By Friday, he had enough cash in hand to feed his family for a month. That was 1931, and the question this video answers is simple. How did ordinary people build real income when the entire system stopped working? To understand why these hustles existed, you have to feel the scale of what happened. By 1933, exactly 24.9% of the American workforce was unemployed. That is nearly 12.8 million people with no paycheck, no safety net worth mentioning, and no app to help them find a gig. What they had was ingenuity, a willingness to work, and neighbors who still needed things done. The informal economy that emerged from that pressure is one of the most underrated chapters in American financial history. Let us start with the one that launched this whole video. Vacant-Lot mini golf was not a quirky novelty. It was a legitimate cash-generating operation built entirely from scrap. Over 30,000 miniature golf links appeared across the United States during the 1930s, most of them thrown together from old pipes, tires, and sheet metal. Operators charged 25 to 50 cents per round. People were desperate for cheap entertainment, and a nickel or a quarter felt like an escape from the weight of everything. That tension between misery and the human need for fun was the entire business model. In the fall of 1930, the International Apple Shippers Association was sitting on a massive surplus they could not move through normal retail channels. Their solution was to sell crates of apples on credit directly to unemployed men. Those men then stood on street corners and sold apples individually for a nickel each. A full crate held roughly 72 apples. Buy 1 crate on credit, sell every apple, pay back the crate cost, and pocket the difference. It was a credit-funded micro-wholesale operation that required 0 storefront and 0 upfront cash. At its peak, an estimated 6,000 apple sellers worked the streets of New York City alone. Here is a hustle that sounds like something a real estate investor would pitch on a podcast today, except people were doing it in Chicago in 1931 without a single spreadsheet. A landlord or a savvy renter would take a standard 6-room apartment renting for $50 a month and subdivide it into 6 tiny units called kitchenettes. Each kitchenette rented for $32 a month. Run the math, $50 in overhead, $192 in revenue. That is a margin that most modern rental investors would celebrate. They did not have apps. They had resourcefulness. Flour and feed sacks were everywhere in the 1930s. Every household that baked bread or kept chickens went through them constantly. A woman in rural Missouri figured out that the cotton fabric in those sacks was perfectly serviceable for making dresses, aprons, and children's clothes. She started selling finished garments to neighbors for a fraction of what a store would charge. The hustle spread so fast and so wide that flour companies eventually started printing floral and gingham patterns directly onto their sacks to attract buyers. The manufacturers were responding to a cottage industry that had organized itself entirely from the bottom up. Urban backyards in the 1930s were not for barbecues. They were production facilities. Families across Chicago, Detroit, and Pittsburgh were raising rabbits and chickens in small pens built from scrap lumber and chicken wire. Eggs sold to neighbors for cash or traded for other goods. Rabbits were butchered and sold as meat when grocery budgets had collapsed to almost nothing. City ordinances existed against it in some places, but enforcement was thin when half the neighborhood was doing the same thing. This was hyperlocal food production turned into a reliable income stream, and it cost almost nothing to start. Picture a man walking slowly down a residential street in 1933, pushing a small cart with a grinding wheel mounted on it, ringing a handbell. He was not a novelty. He was a service provider filling a real gap. When families could not afford new kitchen knives or scissors, they sharpened the ones they had. A knife sharpener charged a few pennies per blade and could work an entire block in an afternoon. The overhead was a whetstone and a wheel, both of which could be sourced for almost nothing. Word of mouth did all the advertising. If your knives came back sharp, your neighbor heard about it by dinner. Junking was not glamorous, but it was reliable. Men and boys walked alleys every morning before the garbage wagons came through, pulling copper wire, iron scraps, glass bottles, and rags from trash piles. Scrap yards paid by weight and by material. Copper was the prize because it paid the most per pound. A determined junker who knew which neighborhoods threw out the best material could piece together a consistent daily income entirely from what other people had discarded. This is flipping in its most stripped-down form. Find something with value that someone else has abandoned and connect it to someone who will pay for it. Coal was the primary home heating fuel in most American cities during the Depression, and it was sold by the ton. A full ton was cheaper per unit, but most struggling families could not afford a ton at once. Here is where one clever hustle stepped in. A man would buy a single ton of coal at bulk price, break it down into small buckets, and sell those buckets door to door at a per bucket price that was higher per pound than the bulk rate. The family paying a little more for a small amount could actually afford it, and the seller captured the margin between bulk and retail. It was arbitrage with a shovel. Boarding house cooking was one of the steadiest income streams available to women during the Depression, and it required nothing more than a kitchen, a stove, and the ability to cook in volume. A woman would take in 4 to 8 single working men as regular meal customers, charging a weekly flat rate for breakfast and dinner. The men got a hot meal without the cost or logistics of a restaurant. The woman covered her own grocery bill and generated surplus cash from the margin. Some boarding house cooks ran this operation for years, building a loyal customer base entirely through word of mouth and the quality of what came out of their kitchen. When people cannot afford new shoes, they repair the ones they have. Shoe cobbling exploded as a side hustle during the Depression because the raw materials were accessible and the skill could be learned quickly. Scrap leather could be sourced from old belts and bags. Some cobblers used cut sections of tire rubber as resoling material because it was durable and nearly free. A cobbler working from a small bench in his garage or on his front porch could charge 25 to 50 cents per pair of resoled shoes and keep several families on his regular rotation. The work was physical, the overhead was minimal, and the demand was constant. Wildcrafting is the practice of foraging wild edible plants, berries, nuts, and mushrooms from fields and woodlands. During the Depression, people in rural and semi-rural areas turned this into a legitimate cash income by selling what they gathered to independent local grocers who could not always source from large distributors. Black walnuts, wild berries, watercress, and certain mushrooms were all marketable. The forager paid nothing for inventory. The only cost was time and the knowledge of where to look and what was safe to pick. It was a supply chain that started in the woods and ended at a grocer's counter for cash in hand. The barter economy during the Depression was enormous, and it operated almost entirely off the books. A man who could fix a leaking roof, repair a broken porch step, or clear a blocked drain would knock on a neighbor's door and offer his labor in exchange for groceries, firewood, or a side of cured pork. No money changed hands. No record existed. The transaction was invisible to any landlord, creditor, or tax collector. This was the handyman barter in its purest form, and it kept households functioning when cash had completely dried up. The skill was the currency, and the neighborhood was the market. Magazine subscription sales were one of the largest commission-based income opportunities available to ordinary people during the Depression, and they required zero upfront investment. Publishers like Curtis Publishing, which produced the Saturday Evening Post and Ladies' Home Journal, ran aggressive door-to-door sales programs that paid commissions on every subscription sold. A salesperson carried nothing but a sample copy and an order form. The pitch was simple, the product was familiar, and the commissions were paid in cash. Thousands of people across the country were running subscription routes through their own neighborhoods, turning door-to-door conversations into reliable weekly income. Street corner busking during the Depression was not a hobby. For musicians who had lost their regular venue work when clubs and dance halls closed, performing on busy street corners and outside lunch counters was a primary income source. A hat placed on the sidewalk in front of a talented performer could collect a meaningful number of nickels and dimes over the course of a day. The best buskers developed regular spots and regular audiences, and some built enough of a local reputation to get hired for private parties and small events. The sidewalk was the stage, and the crowd was self-selecting. If you were good, people stopped. If they stopped, they usually paid. Wash and fold laundry services were a steady earner for women who could access a wash tub, a washboard, and a clothesline. Upper-middle-class families who had not lost their wealth still needed laundry done, and many had lost the household staff they once employed. A woman could take in laundry from 2 or 3 households, wash and press it by hand, and return it folded for a weekly flat rate. It was physically demanding work, but it was reliable, repeat business. The customer base was narrow but loyal, and the service required no storefront, no advertising beyond word of mouth, and no startup cost beyond what most households already owned. Despite the overwhelming unemployment of men during the Depression, the number of married women entering the workforce actually increased during this period. Families needed a second income stream, and women filled that gap through clerical work, service jobs, and the kind of home-based micro-businesses we have been describing throughout this video. This is a detail that gets overlooked in most Depression-era histories, but it is critical context. The informal economy of the 1930s was not just a male story. Women were running boarding houses, doing laundry, tailoring flour sacks, and selling home-cooked meals, often simultaneously, while also managing the household. When Prohibition ended in December of 1933, thousands of people who had been running illicit bootlegging operations were suddenly forced to pivot. The underground distribution networks they had built, the customer relationships, the logistical knowledge of moving product discreetly through a neighborhood, all of that had to be redirected. Many pivoted into legal micro-businesses, small taverns, delivery services, and neighborhood supply operations. The skills transferred even when the product changed. This is one of the more fascinating case studies in Depression-era hustle history because it shows how an entire underground economy reorganized itself around a legal framework almost overnight. One of the most overlooked hustles of the Depression era was the traveling repairman who specialized in appliances and radios. By the early 1930s, radios had become central to American household life, and when one stopped working, families could not simply replace it. A man who could diagnose and repair a dead radio set was worth real money to a household. He could charge $1 or $2 per repair at a time when that represented genuine purchasing power. He needed a set of basic tools, a working knowledge of vacuum tubes and simple circuits, and the confidence to knock on doors and let people know he existed. The repair economy was enormous, and it ran entirely on skill and word of mouth. By 1935, the Social Security Act and the Works Progress Administration began providing some formal relief structure, and the raw desperation of the early Depression years started to ease slightly. But the habits did not disappear. The informal economy, the barter networks, the micro-businesses, the door-to-door services, all of it persisted for decades because the people who built those systems had learned something the formal economy never taught them. They had learned that income does not require an employer. It requires a skill, a neighbor, and the willingness to offer something of value before anyone asks you to. Your grandparents already solved this problem. We just stopped listening. Here is what strikes me every time I dig into this era. None of these 20 hustles required a degree, a credit score, a social media following, or $1,000 to launch. Most of them required one thing: the willingness to look at what your neighbors needed and figure out a way to provide it before anyone handed you permission. The mini golf lot, the apple cart, the flour sack dresses, the coal buckets. Every single one of them started with someone looking at a problem and deciding to be the solution. That is the through line. That is what makes this history worth more than a trivia category. If it worked during the Depression, it is worth a second look. If you made it this far, you already know you are not the kind of person who watches videos for entertainment. You watch to find one idea you can actually test. So pick one from this list that fits what you already have: a skill, a tool, a spare hour, a neighborhood. The apple cart logic still works at a farmer's market. Kitchenette subleasing is called house hacking now, and people are making serious money with it. Scrap flipping never stopped working. The names changed. The mechanics did not. Drop in the comments which one you think still has legs today, and I will see you in the next one.